Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation by the American Iris Society. Please support the organization by becoming a member. Go to irises.org and click on Join. Thank you.
So today I'm going to be talking about three types of miniature dwarf bearded irises, or MDBs. And if you got to attend Debbie Strauss's talk last week, I think you'll find that this one dovetails very closely with that. She was talking about the median irises, and there's quite a bit of connection between the two categories, as you'll see. This is a familiar diagram of the different classifications of bearded irises. This was also shown last week in Debbie's talk. So there's miniature dwarfs, and then going up in height, we have standard dwarfs, SDBs, then intermediates, miniature tall, border bearded, and tall bearded. And for the purposes of this talk, I want to especially draw your attention to the fact that only the miniature dwarf bearded are considered dwarf irises. The SDBs, even though they have the word dwarf in their name, standard dwarf bearded, are considered median irises. And this is a kind of a confusing situation. I know a lot of people, when they first come into the world of irises and the different types, find that very perplexing. Is, what could be more dwarf than a standard dwarf, right? It seems to make sense. The reason for this strange peculiarity goes back to the very beginning of the SDB, the standard dwarf bearded category, which was created in the 1950s. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And it was a new type of iris that had not existed before that time. And so there was actually a great debate about whether they were dwarfs or whether they were something else, intermediates maybe, or whatever. And neither side really wanted to give in. The Dwarf Iris Society, led by Walter Welsh, was very adamant that they were not really dwarfs. And yet they were in the same height range and looked in the garden like many of the other dwarf irises of the time did. So the way the situation was resolved was by calling them standard dwarfs and calling the smaller ones miniature dwarfs, and letting the Dwarf Iris Society preside over the miniature dwarfs and giving the standard dwarfs to the new Median Iris Society. And that's the way it's remained ever since. So let's talk a little bit about those standard dwarfs when they first came into existence, because this is actually essential for understanding what types of miniature dwarfs we have in cultivation today. The first standard dwarfs were created by crossing tall bearded irises. And I have a picture there, I think, of an iris that's probably Olocala, a tall bearded of that time period, and a dwarf species, a dwarf wild iris called Iris pumila, which grows in Eastern Europe. And this is a very, very tiny little iris, typically about 3 or 4 inches tall, only one bloom per stem, and usually with practically no stem at all. The bloom seems to just grow straight out of the rhizome. And it was not known in the US for a long time. But in the 1930s and 40s, people began importing it and trying to hybridize with it. And so when they crossed the tall bearded with Iris pumila, they produced the first SDBs. This was work that was being done by Paul Cook in Indiana and by Geddes Douglas in Tennessee, living in places where the pumilas were blooming in the south at the same time, or in the north at the same time that the tall bearded were blooming in the south. They were able to swap pollen. And so the SDB I've pictured there is green spot, which is one of the first of the 3 SDBs that Paul Cook introduced in 1951. At the time, they were not called SDBs. The category wouldn't exist for another 7 or 8 years. So they were just a new type of hybrid that people were excited about and talking about and trying to classify in some way. So now we get to what the topic of this talk is, which is the 3 different types of MDBs that can be produced. These are the main types that are in existence today that you will find in gardens. And all of them involve, in some way, Iris pumila, that miniature species from Eastern Europe that I alluded to earlier. The first way to produce a miniature dwarf is sometimes if you cross 2 SDBs, you just get a small one. The height limit for SDBs is 8 inches and on up to 16 inches. But sometimes if you cross 2 SDBs, you will get a seedling, a new hybrid that is, say, only 6 or 7 inches tall. And so that properly belongs in the MDB class, because the only requirement distinguishing a miniature dwarf from a standard dwarf is height. So a seedling of SDBs that is below 8 inches is an MDB. Most of the time, of course, when you cross 2 SDBs, you just get more SDBs. But this is a possibility, and it happens often enough that a lot of our most widely grown and popular miniature dwarfs are actually offspring of 2 different standard dwarfs. So I'm calling those type 1. A second way to produce a miniature dwarf is to cross a standard dwarf back with that dwarf species, Iris pumila. Remember, Iris pumila is much smaller than the standard dwarfs. Standard dwarfs may average 10, 12, 13 inches tall. Iris pumila more like 3 to 5. So this is a cross that is much more likely to produce plants that are under 8 inches and fall in the miniature dwarf bearded height range. And for a long time, this was the main way that most miniature dwarf bearded hybridizers worked. They crossed standard dwarfs with Iris pumila, and most of their seedlings were in the miniature dwarf bearded range, and they would just pick the ones that they liked the best, or that had the best qualities to introduce. It's also possible to just cross 2 different forms of Iris pumila with itself. Iris pumila is not just one color or one look. It grows all over Eastern Europe, all the way from Austria east through the Ukraine and the Carpathian Mountains, and even all the way down into the Caucasus Mountains and even far eastern Turkey. So in that huge range, you will see examples of Iris pumila that have every different color you could imagine practically. There's white ones, cream colored ones, yellow ones, purple ones, reddish ones, blue ones. Many of them have a distinctive spot of a darker color on the falls. So if you start mixing and matching spot colors and beard colors along with the basic color of the flower, you just get a huge variety. So it is possible to cross 2 different pumilas and get another miniature dwarf that is purely Iris pumila in origin, but looks different than any other example of the species. And so those are what I'm calling the type 3 MDBs. And these days, we also have a species category. So if a hybridizer is crossing just 2 Iris pumila plants, the resulting seedling could be considered either a species, because Iris pumila is a species and there's nothing else in its background, or if they chose, they could register it as a miniature dwarf. In the past, before the species class was created, the only option for hybridizers was to register it as an MDB. And this is entirely the hybridizer's decision. An iris like this will meet the criteria of both of those classes. So if the hybridizer wants it to be compared with other miniature dwarfs, they can register it that way. Or if they feel it's a better example of a species or of the wild iris pumila, and they want to draw attention to that part of its ancestry, they can register it in the species class. So I will talk first about the type 1s. And these, as you recall, are the ones that come from pure SDB breeding, just crossing one SDB with another. And these days, this type is actually far and away the most common type. I would say every year, probably 90% of the miniature dwarfs that are introduced are from pure SDB breeding. And you can understand why this is. There's a lot of hybridizers, very successful SDB hybridizers. You know, think of people like Paul Black or Terry Aiken or even Keith Keppel, who grow a lot of SDBs and have their own lines. And every year they're crossing SDBs with other SDBs in their garden and producing thousands of seedlings, of which a certain number are going to be small. They're going to be 6 or 7 inches tall and eligible to be registered as miniature dwarfs. And that's a lot more of a productive program for large-scale hybridizers these days than trying to work with the species Iris pumila and making crosses specifically for miniature dwarfs. So these type 1 MDBs, since they come from pure SDB breeding, they are like the SDBs in that they are half pumila and half tall bearded. And you'll see the main difference between these types is what the fraction of pumila is. So these are half and half pumila and half TB. And as I indicated, they're mostly unplanned, by which I do not mean that they were bipods. I mean that the hybridizers were just crossing SDBs in a planned cross for more SDBs. And some of them turned out to be small enough to be in the MDB height range. And I would say that nearly all MDBs since about 1990 are of this type. Other types are still being produced, but these are far, far more common. And one of the advantages that this type has is that they have the widest array of color and pattern available in the miniature dwarfs. This type is the only type where you will get pink miniature dwarfs, orange miniature dwarfs, or any miniature dwarf with a tangerine beard, or even the plicatas and luminatas are found only in this type. So if you see a miniature dwarf with one of those color characteristics, you can be confident that it came from pure SDB breeding. So for example, a plicata like Beetlejuice, which recently won the Caparn Welch Medal for Best MDB, is a plicata, so it comes from this kind of breeding. Some of Keppel's, like Icon Fish and Chips mini-series that are all orange, they also come from this type of background. This is also the type where you will find the most modern form, by which I mean width and ruffling of the petals. And the reason for this is because the SDBs have been developed over the past 70 years with an almost nonstop cycle of improvement in form. In Debbie's presentation on medians last week, you heard about some of the milestones there. The Iris Cotton Blossom by Bennett Jones, and then Chubby Cheeks by Paul Black were also both breakthroughs in getting standard dwarfs that had these more ruffled, fuller form. So obviously, if you're working with crossing modern STBs, the miniature dwarfs that occasionally result from that work are also likely to have this more modern looking form. This type is also the most adaptable to mild winter climates. And I've put here, just as a very loose approximation, zones 4 through 8 with these. Um, Almost everybody grows some SDBs, so you can use your own judgment about whether that zone range applies to you or not. But this is generally the zones in which SDBs do well, and it's also the zones in which type 1 MDBs do well. They have trouble if you have a very, very mild winter climate, like you do in some places of Southern California or Arizona. And they're not as adaptable to the extreme north, for example, Canada and places like in the northern Midwest, as some of the other types are. But I want to use this occasion to bring up some things that you often hear repeated, that although they may have been true 40 or 50 years ago, are no longer that true. I will also often hear people say, oh, I can grow standard dwarfs, but I can't grow MDBs. Our climate is too warm for them. But most of the MDBs, probably 90% of them these days, that you can order from a catalog or a website, are in fact just the same as SDBs. They have exactly the same climate requirements and cultural requirements. So for anyone who says that, I would say, well, how many have you tried? And in particular, which ones are you trying? Because probably if they try any of the modern MDBs that have been introduced in the last 20 or 30 years, they're going to behave just like SDBs in your garden. I've also heard people say, there was one person that I knew a while back said, oh, I can't grow anything with pumila in it. But of course, what he was thinking, I think, was irises that had pumila as an immediate parent. But of course, all the SDBs are 1/2 pumila, as are all these type 1 MDBs. And he claimed to have no problem growing SDBs. So he was growing many plants that were 1/2 pumila, just wasn't aware of it. Some of the downsides of these, you might think, well, this is all upside, right? Got all the best colors, the modern form. They'll grow farther south than some of the other ones well. The downside is that because they come from SDB breeding, they can often turn out to grow like SDBs in somebody else's garden. Maybe in the hybridizer's garden, they're 6 inches or 7 inches, or as I see many of them registered, 7.5 inches or 7.75 inches. But in somebody else's garden, they may grow 9 or 10 inches tall and not look like MDBs at all. So that's something to worry about. And those of us in the Dwarf Iris Society who are really devoted to the MDBs as a distinctive class are very concerned about this, because there's a possibility here that in a lot of places, this type of MDBs are kind of indistinguishable from just SDBs that happen to be a little bit on the small side. And if that's the case, there's not really any point in having a separate class. Another thing which many of us think is a downside is, again, because they come from pure SDB breeding, they tend to bloom at the same type at the same time of the season as other SDBs, which is later than we would like for MDBs. One of the selling points of the miniature dwarfs is that they're the first bearded irises to come into bloom in the spring. And if they don't start until the SDBs are already in full bloom, you sort of lose one of the main advantages of growing the miniatures, at least for a lot of us. Hybridizers can, if they're paying attention to this, of course, can select for it. They can introduce into commerce MDBs of this type 1 that happen to bloom earlier. And we have some good examples of that. Paul Black's Dollop of Cream is always early blooming for me, always seems to come out before most of the SDBs in my garden. Keith Keppel's Orange MDBs also have this characteristic. Mini-series is often one of the very first MDBs to bloom for me. So it's not an insurmountable problem, but it is something to be aware of. And the final possible difficulty here or disadvantage is that they may appear coarse. And what I mean by this is problems of proportion. Since they do come from SDB breeding, it's not unusual to find ones that have SDB-sized leaves. And they're not really going to look like a very good miniature dwarf just because they're 7 inches off the ground if the leaves look like they belong on an SDB, or if the stalk is really thick like an SDB stalk, or if there's 3 or 4 buds and they're kind of crowded because they're all blooming that close to the ground. So these are all things that we have to worry about if we want to grow MDBs that we really think capture the charm of a true miniature instead of just looking like SDBs that happen to be short. Let's look at some pictures of these. Here's one of the Keppel ones that I mentioned, his orange series of miniature dwarfs. This is Icon, very popular, very much in class for me, and I enjoy it greatly, and I've used it in hybridizing. Kino from Tom Johnson is another very attractive little miniature dwarf, and notice the tangerine beard there. That's a giveaway that it's a type 1, that its background is SDB breeding. And of course, that's goes without saying for Icon because it has the tangerine beard and is orange in color. Pearly Whites is a more recent one of Paul Black's that I really, really enjoy. You can see here, this is a very good example of the ruffling in the modern form that we can get in this type of MDB. And for me, it does not grow too big. It always looks like it's in proportion and stays at a reasonable size. So it's another one I enjoy a lot and have used in hybridizing. Again, you can see those tangerine beards, so you know it's a type 1. Beetlejuice, Paul Black, another very popular one and a really distinctive pattern. Although it's a placata, just saying that doesn't really capture the essence of those whiskers and the cuteness of it. For me, it's a little bit variable in height and overall size in my garden. Sometimes it will bloom, look like very compact, like a little miniature, and other times, especially as the season goes on, it can get a little taller and start to look more like an SDB. African Wine by Kasperic. Just to give you an example of the wonderful range of colors we can get in the miniature dwarfs. Beautiful dark wine red. Dollop of Cream by Paul Black, which I mentioned earlier as being early blooming, as well as having that refined form that makes it look quite modern. Tiny Titan by Terry Aitken, another orange one. And the more classic sort of tailored looking MDB, Gecko Echo from Kasperic from 2007. Wonderful color, very distinctive and beautiful. And it also is a type 1, comes from SDB breeding. So just to show you that not all of them look the same and not all of them look the way that Paul Black's do. Okay, moving on to the type 2. Now these, recall, are derived from crossing SDB with back to the species Iris pumila. So if you've been keeping track, the SDBs are half pumila, which makes these 3/4 pumila and only 1/4 tall bearded. So this really gives them a head start in looking and acting like dwarfs, because most of their heritage is from a dwarf species, excuse me, rather than the tall bearded irises. And for a long time, this was considered the classic cross to make if you wanted to produce MDBs. In the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, most of the hybridizers of miniature dwarfs were making this type of cross. It started very early with people like B. Warburton, and moved on to Tony and Dorothy Wellott, and many of the other, Alta Brown, many of the other hybridizers of that era. And so for a long time, this is kind of what people meant when they talked about MDBs. And so this is the source of some of that information, like that MDBs maybe don't do as well in warm climates, because they were talking about this type that was 3/4 pumila, not the modern type, which is usually half pumila. Now, what about the color and color patterns available in this type? This is mostly similar to Iris pumila. You don't have the oranges or the pinks or the tangerine beards or the placatas, but you do have this rather wide range of color and pattern that the species pumila itself shows. White, yellow, cream, blue, purple, and the spot pattern being very prominent. The spot pattern can be either a dark spot that's obviously a spot sort of in the center of the falls. It can go almost all the way to the edges of the falls, or even all the way to the edges, or it can look like rays or little lines or a halo around the beard. So there's all this variation. And this type of MDB probably has more variation in the way the spot pattern expresses itself than the species Iris pumila does. That TB inheritance is just enough to sort of mix things up and give us a greater variety of different looks. They mostly have tailored form, but some are wider and flare more than the pure species Iris pumila does. So there is an interesting variety to be had in this category. I'm saying that their winter adaptability is intermediate and kind of guesstimating zones 3 through 7 as being best there. Although again, these are all very approximate and they vary from variety to variety and from garden to garden. So I always say, don't let these kind of recommendations ever stop you from trying something. Try it and just see what happens. They have an advantage in that they always or almost always stay in class. It's very rare to have one of these grow up beyond the 8-inch height limit. Most of them are 5 to 6 inches and they stay that way. They also have the advantage of early bloom. And this is the time period when you will see all those references to miniature dwarfs being the very first bearded irises to bloom and blooming before the standard dwarfs. Not so much true anymore now that we have the type 1s being so prevalent, but these type 2s, if you're interested in early bloom, seek some of these out and acquire them because they do consistently bloom earlier than the SDBs. If you're a hybridizer, you will be annoyed that some of the irises in this type, in fact, most of them, are not very fertile. They're hard to make crosses with. The technical reason for that is that they're what we call unbalanced tetraploids. But the main impact of that for gardeners is that it was harder for hybridizers to keep working with this type because to get more type 2s, they always had to go back to crossing an SDB with a pumila. They couldn't just cross their type 2s with other dwarfs that they had and expect to get a lot of success. So I think that is also one of the reasons why the type 1s from SDB breeding have sort of taken over in recent years, is they're just easier for hybridizers to work with.
Tom, I do have a question.
Yes, please.
Jane Jordan wants to know, are the type 1s fertile?
Yes, they're just like SDBs in that respect. Very fertile, very easy to cross with, very easy to breed for as many generations as you want to get whatever you want out of them. Thank you. Good question.
Okay, thanks.
Here are some of the type 2s. And you'll see many of these come from earlier years of introduction because, as I was saying, they were prevalent during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So a lot of the best examples are from that time. A perennial favorite is Alpine Lake by the Wellots, which was introduced in 1980. Just a lovely little iris, white with a light blue spot pattern that almost completely fills the falls. So it looks sort of like a bicolor rather than like a white with a blue spot. And unfortunately, over the years, it's started showing a bit of virus infection. So the blue on the falls can sometimes look splotchy if you have cold or wet weather, which is unfortunate because one of the beautiful things about it was this soft, even pastel look that it has. But it's still a very desirable iris, and I grow it in my yard and love to see it every spring. Another very early one is Bee Wings from Alta Brown, 1960. This was one of the first that was produced by crossing SDB with pumila. And you can see that shows that nice spot pattern again, and a different reflection, a different manifestation of it, because it's sort of this fuzzy diffuse spot right around the beard. Doesn't go all the way to the edges of the petals, and even has a sort of little stripe coming out from the beard that is of the fall color rather than the spot color. Here's one called Black Stallion from 1983. And you hardly see any spot pattern there at all, just showing you that this type has a range of colors. We have a very dark sort of reddish purple here that really looks like a self. And Blue Beret from Earl Roberts in 1967, another early one, but you can just see how beautiful of a clump some of these type 2 MDBs make, because they are so small and the foliage is also so small and delicate in proportion that it just seems almost like you would expect on a rock garden plant, you know, a cushion of color and bloom. And notice here again a different variation of the spot pattern. The dark blue spot goes almost but not quite to the edges of the falls, and we have contrasting beards that really set off the spot. Crown of Snow, another one from the Wellots, who kept working with this type of miniature dwarf for quite a while. This was introduced in 2001. Very, very strong, sharp contrast between the dark violet, almost black fall spot and the white standards and fall rim. Here's a reddish one from Kasperic. You can see a cute variety of form. The falls flare almost horizontally, and you get that sort of pointy look to them, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the iris pumila types. But just to show you that there really is a variety amongst these, even without the oranges and plicatas and stuff that we get in the type 1s. Here's another one from the 1980s, Pussy Toe from the Wellots. And just to show you that people are still doing this, here's Wee Dragons, a recent one from Linda Miller, 2017, which is just delightful. Again, you can see we have a nice dark sort of brick red and a brilliantly contrasting pale beard. And one of my all-time favorites back from the 1970s is Zipper by David Sint. Just a wonderful contrast between the rich yellow falls and standards and those delightful sort of electric blue beards. And one from Cleo Palmer in Oklahoma from the 1970s, April Ballet.
And Tom, another question before you go on to type
Yes,
3.
please.
Anna Cad is asking, is type 1 a happy accident when crossing 2 SDBs?
Usually that is the case. Usually the hybridizer is not intending to produce miniature dwarfs. So what will happen is they'll raise maybe 100 seedlings or 1,000 seedlings from a cross and get maybe a dozen of those that are under the 8-inch height limit. And they'll look at those, and one of them, if it looks really good, they will introduce it as an MDB. That's often the case. There are some breeders now who are especially selecting from their SDB lines smaller SDBs and MDBs that are more likely to produce MDBs when they're crossed than just your run-of-the-mill SDBs. So, for example, the orange ones from Keith Keppel, we had an article from him in the last Dwarf Iris Society portfolio where he explained that as he's been working with the orange MDBs, although they all started out from crossing SDBs, more and more he's getting consistently MDB sizes from those crosses using plants of that line. So that recently he's been getting half or more of his seedlings from those crosses being in the MDB height range. So there are some people doing that, but I would say probably 80 or 90% of those type 1s are just lucky accidents. Thank you. That's a very good question.
Thank you. Hey, one other question, just as a point of reference, since you're growing all of these types, what zone are you in northern New Mexico?
I'm in 6A. We used to be 5B until they recently changed the map a decade ago or so. So my winter low temperature is usually around 0, maybe a few degrees below or a few degrees above. One year we got down to -18. Yeah, so thanks. That's also good. That's my climate. Now, what I'm calling the type 3 are pure Iris pumila. So they have no tall bearded in them at all, which produces some interesting results. They're fairly uncommon compared with other types, and they can be hard to find. Not that many people are growing Iris pumila or any bearded species for that matter. So they're kind of few and far between. A lot of these come from the earlier days of dwarf and median hybridizing in the 1950s and 60s, when Iris pumila was still all the rage that people were using to create new types of irises. So a lot of hybridizers had it. These days, not so much. There are still some being produced, but you kind of have to seek them out. Their color range I've discussed before. Pumila has this wide range of yellow, purple, and blue colors and has the spot pattern. The form is always tailored. You won't find any ruffling. Like most species in the wild, it's not ruffled. In some of them, the falls tuck under, but others flare and sort of roll to a point, which we saw in one of the ones earlier and we'll be seeing again. And this flare is considered a very desirable trait by hybridizers. And the reason for that is easy to understand. If the falls flare, then when you're viewing the iris from above, which is almost always the case if it's 3 to 4 inches tall, you will be seeing more of the falls than if they sort of tuck under. So that's considered a very desirable thing. They are the most adaptable to cold winter climates. And again, there I've put a sort of a guess of zones 2 to 6. As I said, I'm in zone 6. I have no problem with them at all. They grow just as easily as any of the other dwarfs. They are the very tiniest. 3 to 6 inches is a typical height range. And they're the earliest. They bloom even before the type 2s. To give you an example of how that works, in my garden, the tall bearded season is sort of late May through early June. The SDB season is early May, maybe some starting at the end of April. And the pumilas, the first ones start almost always the last week in March and carry on through all of April. So that really is quite early for me. If you think of that, that's a good 2 months before the tall beardeds bloom, and a good 2.5 months or even 3 months before the end of bearded iris season. So that's a real season extender. And as you might have gathered from everything else I've been saying, iris pumila is great for hybridizing. If that's one of your hobbies, you'll have endless hours of family fun growing this species in all of its different cultivars. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these are registered in the species class rather than the miniature dwarf class. In the early days, that was not possible. The species class didn't exist, but they all automatically fit the miniature dwarf class because they were bearded irises under 8 inches tall. And these days, it's the hybridizer's choice. And there are some wonderful things here, and they all look very different from each other. You might think, oh, it's just one species. What's the point of having different ones? But here you can see, here's Bitsy Blue from Linda Miller. Linda is one of the few dwarf iris hybridizers today who still has been working a lot with species and with iris pumila, as she has been all through the years, all through her career. You can see just how cute this thing is with that light blue spot and just as dainty as can be. And you can see that desirable pumila form where the false flare and then sort of roll to a point. So the blooms look almost like little triangles sitting on the ground. The next one here is Hidden Dragon, which is actually came from wild collected iris pumila, introduced by Tankersley Clark in 2003. Another Linda Miller one, Hobbit, which also often shows that nice form, although sometimes it doesn't hold and they'll start to tuck a little bit as the flowers age. But you see again this nice, really soft, pure blue color with a darker blue spot. In iris pumila, blue and purple are different genes, unlike the tall beardeds where they tend to be just variations of the same genetic background that you can sort of range between blue and purple. In iris pumila, they're actually different. They're actually controlled genetically differently, and so the blue pumilas don't look like the violet ones or the purple ones. Here's Royal Wonder from Carol Coleman in 2013. This one is a very husky and vigorous plant. It just goes crazy in my garden. And you can see it has that dark purple color. Royal is a good name. And the fall spot is even darker. So this is one that you just see it all the way from across the garden because it's so extroverted and has such a dark color. Sudden Butterflies, which hasn't actually been officially introduced, from Elm Jensen. This was registered in 2010. Another one of those pumilas with a basically white color and a bluish spot. Here you see the spot is more sort of with rays and veins, which give it a somewhat different look. Suslik from the Burtons. This one came out. This one was introduced from seed that was obtained through the Cigna seed exchange. So it was registered as a species because The seed was actually collected in the wild and still produced a very, very nice, wonderful little garden iris. One of my favorites is Little Drummer Boy from the Willets in 1997. There have been a few of these type 3, these pure Iris pumila MDBs that have won the Caparn Welsh medal, which this one did. It was the one to win it most recently, I think perhaps 2005, if I remember correctly. But it has a very, very nice contrast between the white petals and a very rich violet colored spot. The photo doesn't quite do it justice. But again, you can see that nice flaring pointed form, and you can see just how floriferous these miniature dwarfs from pure pumila breeding can be. The plant just covers itself in bloom. Wild Whispers is another one that was introduced in the species class, again coming from seed collected in the wild of Iris pumila. Lesser Goldfinch from Lowell Balmunk in 2003. I have been showing a lot of blue and purple ones. I apologize for that, but here you can see that there's lots of good yellow ones too. This is really bright and cheerful. And notice here how we see yet another manifestation of the spot pattern because it's very soft and sort of diffuse and like it's just watercolor painted on. Another one from Linda Miller, Snips, probably one of the most reddest pumilas that you will come across. She has used this in breeding. It's the pumila parent of the wee dragons, type 2 MDB that we saw a little bit earlier. And now to close off, yes, questions.
Tom, have another question from Anna Cad. What is the % content of genetic material of Iris pumila in advanced generations of modern SDBs?
It's always exactly 1/2. And this is because they're a type that technically we call amphidiploids, which means that the way the chromosomes work, every SDB will always have exactly 2 sets of pumila chromosomes and exactly 2 sets of tall bearded chromosomes. Very good question. Thanks. Okay. Appreciate that.
Just a personal comment. And last year in 2020, I had a big clump of Royal Wonder in full bloom. Looked great. And we got one of those late freezes. It got down to 18, 19 degrees. And I thought, well, this is ending that. And afterwards, it did pretty much end. That ended pretty much all of the SDB bloom. We had just really, really sparse bloom after that with SDBs. But within a week after that, Royal Wonder was back out in full bloom again. You couldn't tell it that it even didn't make a difference, that nothing happened. It was amazing.
That's a great comment, and that's been exactly my experience in the many years I've been growing them. Even as an open flower, they can take several degrees of frost. They can go down into the high 20s and look the same as they did the day before. But even if you get down into the low 20s and you lose the blooms that happen to be open at the moment, the next crop of buds that shoots up will look like nothing happened at all. Yep. It'll be right back. It was so very different from the SDBs and from the type 1 MDBs in that respect, which if you have a good knockout frost, you're probably just not going to see any more of those. I do want to promote the Dwarf Iris Society. That's our website address. If you go there, you'll find lots of information, lots of photos, articles to read, and you can learn all about us and our activities. We have a plant sale every year, a seed sale every year, and a publication that's actually full of interesting articles, or at least we try to make it so every year. and all of our contact information. So I invite you to visit. We're a small group of people, but we're enthusiastic, and we love dwarf irises. That's all I have. Thank you all very much. And if there's any more questions, I'll be happy to answer.
We do have a few more questions. One from Phyllis Wilburn. What are the water requirements?
The same as any bearded irises. So I have mine on the same watering schedule as the tall bearded and the other bearded types, which here in northern New Mexico, where it does get quite dry in the summer, amounts to putting a soaker hose on them once a week.
Okay. And then from Janice Shackelford, she says, I'm in Southern California, zone 9B. I've tried to grow SDBs with no success. What is the maximum temp in your garden? Would I be able to plant an SDB in a pot and store it in the winter in a fridge?
That ought to work by principle, because you're on the right track. The reason that those SDBs and MDBs don't do well in that climate is not because of the hot summers, but because they don't get the cold winter that they need for chilling. So if you had the refrigerator space, it might be something worth trying. I would be skeptical though, because unless you have lights on them all the time, they're going to shrivel up from the darkness. I suppose if you had your refrigerator set up with lights, you might be able to pull that off. In my home, I certainly couldn't get away with using a refrigerator for that purpose. But if you have one and would like to try it, go ahead. It's an interesting experiment, and let us know what happens.
And then Joe Vanderveer says, are there other MDB species other than pumila?
Yes, there are. And I didn't talk about them because I was mostly talking about varieties that are commercially available at the present time. But remember, I sort of started my talk when the first SDBs were created in the 1950s. And of course, there were dwarf irises long before then. And most of them were from a species that is called Iris lutescens. In the old days, most people knew it by the name Iris cami iris. And those were the standard dwarfs before the SDBs were created. And some of the irises from that early period were hybrids involving Iris lutescens, sometimes with Iris pumila, sometimes with taller irises like Iris aphylla. There's also a species that I have been using in hybridizing that is Iris reichenbachii, which can grow out of class. It grows in a height range of maybe 6 to 10 inches, and you never know exactly where it's going to be. But it is a true dwarf. It doesn't have branches, and it has very delicate flowers, delicate stems. And so that's another example of a dwarf species. There are also some really small diploid species. There's one called Iris attica and another called Iris suaveolens. And both of those are even smaller than pumila, if you can believe it. So yeah, if you're curious about the bearded species, there's a good number of dwarf species that you can seek out. Thank you. That's an interesting question. Maybe a whole other presentation on that subject someday.